welcome to the Foggy Dew. This is Colin. Well, gang, we have an absolutely massive week ahead of us. I am so excited for July 4th, it's crazy. 250th July 4th, the 250th anniversary of this country being founded. Just absolutely amazing. I'm really hoping this week is just like this kind of smorgasbord of pro-America stuff. I think the culture is ready for it. I think people are super excited about it. I just find myself this week just so excited for next weekend. And I hate to say it's the beginning part of the week, and here I am. I'm already looking forward to next weekend, but here we are. So I think this is just going to be a week for the history books. I'm so excited about July 4th. So big week ahead. And I have a ton of content here. So I guess with that, I'll go ahead and dive into the show. And I think anybody that listens to the Foggy Dew knows that I'm extremely interested in military history. And why I'm interested in military history, it's just important to understand actions that were taken. Like why would somebody in the military do this? Why would somebody in the military do that? And I think you find, if you look at all this stuff and you look at military history, most things that occurred in military history, specifically in the US, occurred out of necessity rather than any type of requirement. And that evolution is so interesting to watch. And I think specifically, like if you look at like the evolution of equipment, I think that's like one of the most fascinating things. Like you went from like a musket to a rifle to an AR now, like a flintlock pistol to a revolver to a Sig Sauer of today. And it's interesting watching that evolution because the biggest explosion in military history really started in the American Civil War. And one part of the Civil War that I always thought was super interesting was how soldiers ended up identifying themselves. There was this common practice that emerged from the trenches of the Civil War where soldiers wanted to mark their bodies. Like before a large battle, soldiers would mark their uniform with a stencil. They would write their name on their clothes. And a lot of times these guys would write their name on like a piece of paper and then pin it to their clothes. There were men in the trenches that would carve their names into coins, pieces of metal, wood. These men, really boys in a lot of situations, these men and boys knew that they would likely die. And what they wanted was a way to identify their remains afterwards. I said they would carve stuff. They'd carve wood, copper, anything to identify their body. Some soldiers and officers actually engraved metal tags if they could afford it. And this whole process of identification actually had this like kind of pop-up market evolve. Vendors would actually follow armies, both Union and Confederate. These vendors would follow these armies and they would sell identification discs. And the reasoning behind all this is totally obvious. Statistically, in the Civil War, 40 to 50% of soldiers, both sides, were eventually unidentified. So here you have these brave men on both sides, unidentified soldiers. They'd be buried without markers because nobody knew who they were. Well, I don't know anybody that wants to be buried in an unmarked grave. I mean, you had tens of thousands of men and boys, tens of thousands of men and boys who died in that conflict, that their final resting place was an unmarked, unknown grave. Like if you look at like Vicksburg, Vicksburg has about 17,000 Union graves. That is the largest Union graveyard in the United States. So here you have Vicksburg, 17,000 graves. Almost 70% of the graves at Vicksburg are unknown. So you have these heroes that nobody knows who they are, their name or any of it. And when I was a kid and I used to think about this whole dynamic, like that's got to be a horrible feeling before a battle. Here you have maybe a 16, 17-year-old kid that's sitting in a trench that knows they're going to be charging into the field of battle the next day, likely into heavy fire. Well, you're just praying to God to survive the next day. And here you are praying to God, and then your thought is that you could be buried without recognition. That's got to be a scary prospect. Your family wouldn't even know what happened to you. And maybe that's the best way to think about it. You're thinking about your loved ones at home at that time. If you're identified, at least they can know that you're at rest. They can know what happened to you. Well, that need to identify US soldiers became more acute after the Civil War. So by the end of the Spanish-American War, which ended in 1899, it became very necessary for the US military to have standardized identification. So the backstory on that is that there was this chaplain, and this chaplain was named Charles Pierce. So this guy sees this whole situation, this whole dynamic of identifying soldiers. Well, Charles Pierce was a Morgan identification officer in the US military. Well, this Pierce guy at the end of the Spanish-American War, he started recommending that the US military standardize ID to soldiers and do it through the War Department. Well, so Pierce makes this recommendation because he's seeing this problem, and it took a couple years to wind its way through the military, but finally it was approved. The military agreed that they needed to standardize this process. So starting in 1906, the US Army then required soldiers to have tags, and those tags back then were pretty simple. So basically what it was in 1906, it was a small disc, basically about the size of a $50. It was a small disc that could be worn under the uniform. Well, on that tag, on that disc, it had the soldier's name, it had the rank, and it had the company. Well, that very basic design was not modified until World War I in 1916. What they figured out in World War I with what became known as dog tags, they needed 2 discs per man. Well, why would you need 2 discs? Well, you would need a disc that stayed with the body, and then the second disc would actually go to the War Department for record keeping. Now, I said the US Army did this. The US Navy did the same thing, but it was slightly different. The initial tags from the US Navy would have US Navy on them, so USN, and it would also have the person's fingerprint etched into the disc. Well, it's interesting. So you get through World War I. So World War I ends, and so did the requirement for tags. There wasn't a need for it. So interestingly enough, there were no dog tags provided to soldiers in the interwar period. And I say dog tags, they actually were not called dog tags until 1936. And you might be curious where that name even came from. Well, William Randolph Hearst coined that term. And Hearst was like a newspaper billionaire. He was a newspaper magnate. That's who Hearst was. His daughter was Patty Hearst. But William Randolph Hearst hated, for good reason, at least in my humble opinion, Hearst hated FDR, and he hated the New Deal. Because what happened was when FDR established the New Deal included Social Security Administration. So here you have this new branch of government. Well, the Social Security Administration was looking at that time to give each citizen like this metal tag for their Social Security number. Social Security numbers did not exist until the New Deal. So the thought process was, look, if we're going to do this, what we're going to do is give every citizen a tag with their Social Security number on it. Well, Hearst correctly thought that was obscene. Hearst's position was that citizens are citizens, not dogs. But William Randolph Hearst is the person that coined the term dog tags. So that was in 1936. Well, in 1941, the military then resumed having ID required in dog tags for obvious reasons. World War II was kicking off. But this whole process of identifying a soldier in the process of the evolution of dog tags, that started back in the trenches of the Civil War, and it ends up where you're at today. But let's be, even today, like dog tags are probably not even needed anymore today. With technology now, it's super easy to identify the dead. But I think it's interesting, like even looking at this whole dynamic about dog tags, identification of soldiers, you have 150 years ballpark of military history that's hanging around each soldier's neck even today. And I guess if you look at it from like just a historical perspective, the men and women that gave their last measure of devotion for this country deserve our recognition. But I just think it's interesting that that practice from the Civil War still exists today and it hangs around the neck of every US service member. So, anyways, we approach the 250th anniversary, just something to think about. So, I wanted to follow up on one of the topics that I discussed last week. And I guess the best place to start, there is a trend in history where it seems like in retrospect that things just happened. And it's interesting, like it just popped up out of the ether. What, unfortunately, politics and history are usually never a single event, but it's like a series of events over a number of years. And I kept thinking about this entire situation about what occurred in New York. Look at Vladimir Lenin. If you look at the life of Vladimir Lenin, he didn't become a revolutionary overnight. Lenin's father died when he was just 15 years old, and he loved his father. Well, when Lenin's father died, that caused like this huge emotional recoil in a person like Vladimir Lenin. What it did is it caused Lenin to renounce God. He was so angry that his father died. So here he is, a 15-year-old renouncing God. He's had a major person in his life die. Well, he became very erratic at a young age. That started his schism in his brain. Well, while he's in this emotional recoil about his father, his brother was actually executed. You heard that correctly. Lenin's brother, and this is something that kind of gets glossed over with everything with Lenin. Lenin's brother, the one that was executed, was like a normal person, but he became like radicalized in university. His brother, when he got to university, became like this huge left-wing radical. His brother had been working with leftist socialists. Well, those leftist socialists that his brother worked with wanted to overthrow the czar and the monarchy. So here you have Lenin's brother that's becoming totally radicalized at university. He became heavily involved in a plot to create a bomb to kill the czar. So Lenin's brother, a radicalized leftist socialist, was trying to plot a coup to murder the czar. Well, this whole group of conspirators was caught, Lenin's brother among them. So Lenin's brother is caught and executed for trying to uncork this plan. So if you look at Lenin specifically, when he's like 15, 16 years old, Lenin had a dead father and a brother who was executed as a civil dissident, again, 15, 16 years old. Well, shortly after that, Lenin went to university himself. When Lenin hit university, he's already erratic. And then when he gets there, he goes hard left, hard radical left. He became a militant revolutionary when he got to college. By the time Lenin had graduated from university and he was in his mid-20s, he was a hardcore student of Marxism. What Lenin believed coming out of university was that Russia was changing. It was changing away from a monarchy to a capitalist system. Well, in Lenin's view, that switch from the monarchy to capitalism would entrench the upper class. You're basically trading one system for another. He viewed monarchy the same as he viewed capitalism. And Lenin believed that the urban working class was the key to implement socialism. So if you keep rolling this ball forward, by 1900, when he was 30 years old, this guy is a full-blown radical. So by 1900, Lenin was working with other Marxist elements in the underbelly of Russian politics. Lenin was holding socialist revolutionary meetings by 1903. Well, if you follow what happened in Red Russia, but in 1903, a schism had appeared in the socialist revolutionary arm that Lenin was a part of. Lenin led the Bolsheviks, which were the majority. They were opposed by the Mensheviks, which was the minority. So if you look at politically speaking, in 1903, Lenin was the leader of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of politics in Russia. And largely in 1903, Lenin was dismissed as a complete lunatic. So he's being dismissed as a lunatic, but what Lenin kept doing is he kept mobilizing young activists. Young activists are always the most radical, the most pliable to this type of commentary. What Lenin did, even though he was being dismissed and he was a fraction of a fraction, what he did is he ended up using those people and consolidated power in the minds of young members of the Bolshevik Party. But when he had that group marshaled, when he had those young Bolsheviks under his spell, he made his move. What he did with those young minds, what he did with those people is he demanded ideological purity, and there's a reason for that. The cause then to the people in the Bolshevik Party, the cause is absolute. Ideological purity is needed. So what he's doing in layman's terms at that point, he's securing the craziest people first. He promised these young Bolsheviks free everything. Lenin promised them that the system must change and that they would be the people to lead the revolution. He framed society as oppressor versus oppressed. If you view society as oppressor versus oppressed, then that system must then change because it is inherently unfair. That's how they create class warfare. What he does beyond that, Lenin did, he demonized normal businesses and capital. Well, if you're a young, pliable zealot that is now being demanded of ideological purity, these young people were locked out of capital and business. This is music to their ears. They're locked out of this system for forward advancement, and Lenin is promising them that they will be leaders. All they have to do is just go along with the ideology. Lenin was great at creating an other. He created an other, somebody that you could hate. Hate is a base human emotion. He taught these young people to hate. Hate the system, hate the oppressor, hate capitalism. And then what he did on top of it, again, demanded ideological purity. So what happened is that Lenin slowly started aggregating power. Well, how did he start aggregating power with this group of crazy people that were being dismissed as loons? Remember, he had the zealots, the most fanatical people. Those fanaticists wanted ideological purity, and what they did is they started attacking moderates in the other fractions of Russian politics. Moderates to the zealot are not ideologically pure. So what Lenin did, how he corralled power, is he convinced his supporters that moderates in Russian politics were the problem. That the moderate was straddling the fence between the monarchy and the revolution, and they were the problem to forward progress. Well, those same moderates that we're talking about, that Lenin identified, those moderates were eventually eaten by the base. So by 1917, 14 years later, Lenin and the Soviets were in charge. So if you look at the scope of Lenin's life, from about the age of 15 to 40, it took about 20 years. It took about 20 years from Lenin's brother being executed out of university and his father dying to a complete overthrow of the Russian Republic. And he completely changed 20th century history in the world. And it was a fraction of a fraction of a fraction that changed history. Look at that whole dynamic when you look at US politics. Politics doesn't happen overnight. I made a list of these things that have been introduced in our society over the last, 10, 15 years. DEI, woke, LGBTQ, wealth redistribution, anti-police, anti-law, anti-history, anti-white, anti-family, pro-abortion, pro-trans, gun confiscation, educational subversion. It's like saying math is racist. Do you remember this? Anti-capitalist, BLM, reparations, tearing down statues. They even do this in politics and law. They're destroying the judiciary, opening the borders. In the last 20 years, we've had large government takeovers of the economy. Look at Obamacare. Obamacare changed 20% of the US economy into centralized government overseeing. But my point with listing all those things is that brick by brick, these are bricks that have been laid by the establishment rhino class in the Democrat Party. This is what's been introduced into American society. these people, the establishment wings of both political parties, celebrated these things. There are still Republicans that have pronouns in their bios. So this isn't just a Democrat rant, but people in our politics celebrated this introduction of craziness. They cultivated it. And now the fruit is ripe for them to harvest. And I keep thinking about what happened in New York City the other day, and I always want to watch the response. And everybody that listens to Foggy Dew knows this. Always watch the response. Because the day after the socialist Muslim communists won in New York City, this whole thing started. There was a snowball that started last week. The day after those elections in New York City, the knives came out. Here's Alyssa Slotkin. Alyssa Slotkin, who is the ex-CIA senator from Michigan, chimed in on this deal. And to be clear who Alyssa Slotkin is the same lady from the Seditious Six video with Mark Kelly. And again, she's a CIA person. So the day after these communists won in New York City, she's calling for Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer to step aside. You have a sitting senator now calling for ranking members to leave the party. And I hope everybody realizes the importance of that and how seismic that is. That is a full-blown mutiny in the party. Again, watch the response. Here's Gavin Newsom. Gavin Newsom sees where all this is headed. Gavin Newsom posted a video on X the very next day, and what he's doing now in this video, he is calling for a, quote, national billionaires tax, end quote. He wants a national billionaires tax. Mind you that California has a billionaires tax that is sitting on legislation that is up for a vote in November of this year, and capital and all the billionaires are fleeing California right now. But now Gavin Newsom knows this. He's seeing the billionaires flee, but what he's calling for now is a national billionaires tax, federal. And he's saying that because a national billionaires tax is exactly what the communists want. They want to tax the rich. What these people are arguing for, the base of the Democrat Party, the socialists and communists, what they're arguing for, that is anti-capitalist wealth redistribution. Newsom wasn't done with this billionaires tax. He wants a new social contract. He wants a new social contract, and I'm assuming probably one where he's in charge. What trope does he use? He uses the oppressor trope. He's sitting here saying that 10% of Americans own 2/3 of the capital. He argues wages have stagnated in the US. The cost of living is through the roof. So what is his response to these problems that we're faced with? It's not working through the problem. It's a new corporate tax. He wants a new federal tax. He wants an inheritance tax. By Gavin Newsom's estimation, all of these new taxes, a billionaire tax, corporate tax, federal tax, inheritance tax, they're all needed. He's saying that those taxes are needed for an economic reset with a new social contract. This guy is second in line. He is in second pole position to be the 2028 Democrat presidential candidate. But from a political science standpoint, what I would tell you is that Gavin Newsom is seeing the writing on the wall. It's like the Democrat Party had a caged pet. And that caged pet was communism. What they did is they fed it, they petted it, they walked it to the cities to burn the cities down when they didn't get their way. But I guess the establishment Democrat Party always thought that the communism was going to be its pet and that it would stay in its cage. Well, unfortunately for these guys, now the pet is out of the cage. Not only is the pet out of the cage, it's actually eating its owner. And if you look at a person like Gavin Newsom, his own state is failing with these policies, but here he is calling for it at a federal level. I talked about subverting the judiciary. His final argument in this screed that he put online is that he wanted to pack the Supreme Court. His reasoning for that? This is a quote. Quote, "We gotta consolidate power," end quote. What I would tell you is that Gavin Newsom is not considered a progressive in the Democrat Party. He's considered a moderate. He's a moderate. He is not a progressive Democrat if you look at the scope of the party. But the phrases that this man is using, a moderate in the party, the phrases and the tropes that Gavin Newsom is now using, these are straight out of the Bolsheviks' Guide to Revolution. And he's not alone. It's not just Gavin Newsom. Hakeem Jeffries is already pivoting on this issue as well. Here's Hakeem. This is the ranking Democrat in the Congress. Here's Hakeem Jeffries opening the door to the communist pet. Quote, "Congratulations to our newest members of the New York City delegation. From public servants to union organizers to community activists, the path is different, but the work is the same. We must decisively address the affordability crisis and crush far-right extremism," end quote. Quote. Calm down there, Mao. Crush far-right, must crush capitalism. That's the ranking Democrat, man. Look, if blue somehow wins in November, that man would be the Speaker of the House. Talking about crushing right-wing extremism, that would be the Speaker of the House. But if you go through any of these guys, Obama, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Kamala Harris, they're all in on it. Here's Cory Booker. Cory Booker called for America to embrace socialism in a speech. He's calling for America to embrace socialism in a speech that he gave last week. Quote, here's Cory Booker, quote, "We see people in our country who have the courage to stand up. We should applaud and celebrate that," end quote. Booker loves the insurgents, man. He wants socialism because he knows that's where the energy is. AOC, the brilliant thought leader of this party, she said socialism is growing the party, pretends to be a, quote, "good sign for November," end quote. So here's AOC saying socialism growing the party is a good sign for November. And I'm just going to make a side note on AOC real quick. She is absolutely hilarious. I was watching this clip about AOC. So here's AOC going on MSNBC, and she's sitting on MSNBC, and she's asked about the new socialist belief in like abolishing the border, because all these New York City Congress people are like arguing to abolish the border, that borders are racist. Like one of the New York City commies specifically, like in their manifesto said that the border should be abolished. So she's asked about it by Jen Psaki, and here is AOC's response to this question. So her response to the question about abolishing a border. AOC, quote, "We have to give people the opportunity to occupy their beliefs within the gravity of becoming a duly elected member of Congress." Truly a dizzying intellect. Occupy their beliefs. We have to give people the opportunity to occupy their beliefs within the gravity of becoming a duly elected. How does anybody listen to this? Occupy their belief. That is just great stuff. That's great stuff by Comrade AOC. I guess moving beyond the ridiculousness of that person, you have to look at like, what's the plus side of what happened last week? So there were 13 Democrat members of Congress who spoke out about this. So again, 13 Democrat members of Congress spoke out against the rise of socialism and communism in the party. What they did, these 13 Democrats, they published a thing called, quote, "Promise to America." What they're doing in this Promise to America thing, they're claiming capitalism is the way forward, not socialism. They want safety for the American people, not lawlessness. And the funny thing about that is you're seeing this schism happen in real time. Those 13 people should join the Republican Party tomorrow. And I think that that's ultimately the trend here. But it's almost interesting when you look at it about just these 13 people. So you have 13 people out of what, like 214 or something? So you have 13 people out of let's just say it's 214. So basically what that is, that means you have like 5% of Congress on the Democrat side that are seeing what's going on here and they don't like it. 5% of it is pathetic. Only 5% of people on the Democrat side of the aisle are speaking out against socialism? How does that even make sense? What that tells you is that the majority are on board with this, or they're scared of it. So you got 95% of the Democrat caucus that are on board with this, but they're not ideologically pure. They're Lenin's moderates. So you've got 95% of people in the Democrat caucus that are not ideological pure, and they're going to be consumed by this. And I guess the question that you really want to ask yourself was, where does this go eventually? And the only thing I can tell you just as a practical matter is that the Democrat Party, as currently constituted, cannot take power back federally. They cannot have a trifecta. If they had a trifecta, forget about it. But the Democrat Party, as currently constituted, cannot take power back over. They can't take over back power if we want peace. Because what they're doing is they're playing footsie with a dystopian grenade waiting to explode in their face. Because the first thing they're going to do, they're going to activate all these things. Taxes out the yin yang, court packing, opening the border, gun confiscation. What would happen is if these people took back charge federally, they would move to a one-party state so fast it would make your head spin. And what would happen at that point is America would balkanize. America would balkanize. You would have major economic ruination with all these taxes. It would kill capitalism. And I would think eventually one of the likely outcomes would be some sort of civil war. And the problem with all this, there is no way to peacefully separate at this point. You have to peacefully separate, but how would you accomplish that? You have to have a peaceful separation at a certain point if this whole lift of socialism and communism isn't stymied. And it's interesting looking at it from the response of the Republican side. Donald Trump, after all this occurred, had a bunch of like True Social posts, X posts about the federal government combating communism. And he's right, that's the battle now, but I don't know how you do that legislatively. And it's not even fair to say it's communism. It's really like a hybrid of things. Communism is probably the easiest label to apply on it, but it's like this, whatever this rise is, it's anti-Semitic, pro-Islam, Sharia law, socialist, collectivist. There are elements of all that inside this movement. And really what all those things are, the anti-Semitism, the pro-Islam, the socialist collectivism, what those are is just tired tropes from the 20th century that don't work. I mean, we see what's happening in California right now. It's bankrupt. Is that what you want at the federal level? So we're just going to start applying class grievance, economic grievance across the United States when places like Texas and Florida are doing amazing? It's societal subversion by these people. And look, if you're asking me, I think we're going to be fine long term. But there's going to be a lot of moderates that are going to start rejecting this. Moderates will start rejecting this because there is not some broad appetite for this flavor of communism. And the interesting thing about America is that power is diffused in America because our founders were brilliant. You got to secure voting. You got to secure the border. You have to aggressively prosecute fraud. You've got to aggressively prosecute fraud in places like Minnesota, California, New York, etc. The culture in America is changing. Politics is changing. The right wing is going to get even more right wing. It's going to be swelled with people that are now politically homeless with the Democrat Party changing. So the ranks of the right are going to swell. Kids are trending right. You're watching the Democrat Party broadly in the United States implode on itself. It's not a national party at this point. And I had to laugh when I was writing this whole thing out, thinking about the Democrat Party kind of going on the tubes. It's really funny when you start seeing USAID money, NGO money going away and culture changes. It's the same thing that happened in Latin America. But I guess I'm just looking at all this stuff with what happened last week in New York City. It's just interesting that we have to study history. You're going to be forced to repeat it. And I think anybody that knows me knows I keep a lot of quotes in my phone. Well, one that I look at all the time, it's actually a standalone quote in my phone. In 1944, so while World War II is raging, there was a communist rally. Remember, we were partnered with Red Russia. Russia was our ally in World War II. So here you have 1944, a communist rally in New York City, of all places. Communist rally in New York City at Madison Square Garden. There was a speech given at that rally by a man named Alexander Trachtenberg. So Trachtenberg was a US citizen. He was a Yale graduate. He was a communist. What this guy did is he published books on communism in the US. Here's this quote from this guy. Alexander Trachtenberg, quote, "When we get ready to take the United States, we will not take it under the label of communism. We will not take it under the label of socialism. These labels are unpleasant to the American people and have been spared too much. We will take the United States under labels we have made very lovable. We will take it under liberalism, under progressivism, under democracy, but take it we will," end quote. We will take the United States under labels we have made very lovable. We will take it under liberalism, under progressivism, under democracy, but take it we will. Communists never stop. It's the same thing over and over again. In this democracy part, this is why anybody talking about our democracy, you need to look at with a raised eyebrow. Democracy is another word for communism. That's exactly what it is. It's coded language by communists. This has been the plan for 40 years, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. America is the prize, but our founders were brilliant. Anyway, just more thoughts coming out of that whole thing in New York. So with it being the 250th anniversary of July 4th, I thought a really cool US story was probably called for on the Foggy Dew. I've had this story that I wrote, and it's one of my favorite stories about World War II, and I've been sitting on it for a while, and I'm like, you know what? It's a good week for it. I'm going to go ahead and tell this story. So I guess the preface to this story is that when you think of the Pacific theater of World War II, you're normally thinking about, like, it's always like in these like grainy footage from World War II. But when you're thinking about the Pacific theater in World War II, you normally think about like tropical island warfare. Like you have Marines fighting the Japanese on beaches and like the baking sun, everybody's sweating. But I guess, are you aware that Japan and US forces fought in the snow? Were you aware of that? Did you know that Japan and the US fought in the snow in World War II in the Pacific theater? And not only did they fight in the snow, but they fought on North American soil. This whole thing that I'm going to go through with you is called the Forgotten Battle. So I guess the background on this is that as Japan was preparing for World War II, they were very, very worried about Alaska. They were very worried about Alaska and specifically the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese military viewed the Aleutian Islands as very, very critical to Japanese efforts in the Pacific. And why? The Aleutian Islands, like if you look at a map, the Aleutian Islands are like this like tail. It's like a southwest tail coming out of Alaska. They like angle like south and west away from Alaska. And really what the Aleutian Islands do is they kind of point at Russia, but also at Japan. But what happened is that the Japanese military figured that the Aleutian Islands would be the logical attack staging area for US operations in the Pacific. And what they thought too, if you look at a map and the geography of it, the Japanese military also thought that they could, if Russia and the US were to combine forces, they thought if the Japanese held the Aleutian Islands, if they held the Aleutian Islands, that they would drive a wedge between Russia and the US geographically. But I guess any which way you want to look at it, the Japanese military saw the Aleutian Islands as extremely strategic to the Pacific for a variety of reasons. Well, it was so critical in the view of the Japanese military that they committed a massive force to taking over the Aleutian Islands. So Admiral Yamamoto was in charge of the Pacific theater for the Japanese, and he gave the Aleutian Islands this amount of hardware: 2 aircraft carriers, 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 6 subs. That's an armada. So what Yamamoto wanted to do, he had designs on invading the Aleutian Islands and controlling them. So you had this massive force of Japanese naval power, this massive Japanese force attacked Dutch Harbor on June 3rd, 1942. And Dutch Harbor, if you don't know, Dutch Harbor was a U.S. naval base on Mackinac Island, which that was their first objective. So you had this U.S. base sitting here at the first part of the Aleutian Islands, Dutch Harbor. Well, Dutch Harbor, you can imagine, was a sitting duck for the Japanese. Dutch Harbor doesn't have any kind of hardware to repel all those subs and aircraft carriers, all that. So what happened was is that the Japanese crept up there, and then the Japanese aerial bombed Dutch Harbor for 2 straight days. That was the first aerial attack on North America ever. But if you look at the bombing of Dutch Harbor itself, the attack bombing of Dutch Harbor itself caused relatively little damage. The US had like a few buildings destroyed, few planes destroyed. You unfortunately had about 40 American soldiers killed in that attack. You had about 50 wounded. Now, the main takeaway from Dutch Harbor, like if you look at the broad scope of the war, that action in and of itself was relatively innocuous. But the main catch of the Dutch Harbor attack was that the US forces actually captured a Japanese Zero plane. So, which is an attack fighter of the Japanese Navy. One of the Zeros that had launched off one of these Japanese aircraft carriers had actually been forced to crash land on Alaskan soil. So the Zero crashes, the plane was recovered, and it was reverse engineered by the US military. Well, the capture of that Zero allowed the United States military to understand how to effectively dogfight the Zeros. It's just so interesting. There's so many things that happen on this. So here you have this Dutch Harbor attack occurring. They captured the Zero. Well, at the same time this Dutch Harbor attack was occurring, so was the Battle of Midway. And if you look at it from a military history perspective, the attack on Dutch Harbor was later viewed as a feint by the Japanese military to distract the Americans from what was going on at Midway. So the Japanese are attacking this low volume target in Dutch Harbor. Well, they're realizing Midway's going on and they're losing the battle. So you've got Midway raging, and then the Japanese fleet then at that point disengaged from the Aleutians. They're like, we got to go support our guys at Midway. So the fleet, this enormous Japanese fleet that was up in the Aleutian Islands, attacked Dutch Harbor, but then they were pulled back to Midway. So the fleet left, but they deployed ground troops before they left. So before the fleet left, the Japanese invaded 2 islands in the Aleutian Islands with ground troops. So Kiska was the first island invaded. That was invaded June 6th, and then Atta was invaded on June 7th. So you have 2 islands in the Aleutian chain that are now invaded by Japanese ground forces. And it's interesting when you look at the invasion of the Aleutian Islands, this is the first land invasion on U.S. soil since the War of 1812 when the British landed and destroyed D.C. So the Japanese invaded Kiska with about 5,400 men. And the funny thing about all of this is that, like, if you look at like Dutch Harbor and Kiska and Atta, Kiska is basically undefended. There's nobody there. There's nobody there. So the Japanese go into Kiska, they get 5,400 guys. They occupied Kiska for about a year, totally unopposed. Nobody cared. There was nothing there. Well, by August of 1943, so about a year later, the United States and Canada, they finally sent in men to clear out the Japanese on Kiska. Well, the funny thing is that, so the Americans sent in people to Kiska to clear out the Japanese. Well, the Japanese on Kiska had evacuated 2 weeks before that happened. Now, the problem with that, when the U.S. went back over and captured Kiska, again, unopposed, the Japanese that had been there for a year had left all these booby traps. So they left booby traps all over Kiska, so there were about 100 U.S. casualties when they went back in and took over the island. Now, Attu is totally different than Kiska. So Japan invaded Attu with about 3,000 men. So they invade Attu, they secure Attu, and what they did is they built an airstrip and fortifications all around the island. Now, remember what's occurring here. The U.S. is totally engaged. They're occupied in Midway. So Japan is doing this completely unopposed. So you have this unopposed Japanese occupation force on Attu for basically a year digging in. So about a year later in May 1943, the U.S. was ready to go back in and take their stuff back. So the 7th Infantry landed on Attu in the Aleutian Islands on May 11th, 1943. So here you have the 7th Infantry making amphibious landings on their home soil. The Battle of Attu then commenced on U.S. soil in snowy conditions. I said the Japanese had been there for a year. These men, the Japanese soldiers, were entrenched and fortified on a 2. It took the 7th Infantry 2 weeks to push them back. So the 7th Infantry had about 15,000 men to Japan's 3,000. So what happened was they pushed them all the way across the island. So they pushed them. Japanese retreat. The 7th pushed the Japanese into a pocket, and they put them into a pocket where their backs were to the ocean. So here you have the surviving Japanese in a pocket with their backs to the ocean, and they have no escape plan. Well, I'm sure you can imagine what happened next. That pocket was the Japanese final stand on a 2. So May 29th, after 18 days of combat, the Japanese have no options left. So what they did is the Japanese commander led his remaining troops in a suicide banzai charge against the American advance. So the Japanese do a suicide banzai charge at the advancing Americans, and the Japanese are annihilated. The United States lost 549 men in the Battle of WW2. The Japanese, however, were totally wiped out. They only took 28 prisoners. So you had, 2,900 Japanese killed? But that final charge, that banzai charge, ended Japanese efforts in the Aleutians. They're all dead. And the funny thing about it is when you look at this whole thing with like Midway and then the Battle of WW2, at that point in the war, the U.S. was already over on the hump on its way down. The Japanese were already receding back to Japan at this point. So the Battle of WW2 wraps up. The Japanese had lost at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto had been killed. The tide had turned in the Pacific. So what happened was with the Battle of Midway, Yamamoto being killed, these things with Dutch Harbor, Kiska, and Attu, they got largely forgotten about. And it's funny, I think that's so interesting with like the Battle of WW2. There was an interesting wrinkle in the Battle of WW2. There was a Medal of Honor awarded. So there was a Medal of Honor awarded the Battle of WW2. So a guy named Joseph Martinez won the Medal of Honor at the Battle of WW2. Martinez was actually the first Hispanic American and the first Colorado resident in World War II to win a Medal of Honor. Pearl Harbor alone had 15 Medals of Honor. But Martinez, if you look at this whole thing with the scope of Pearl Harbor and then WW2, Martinez was the first man beyond Pearl Harbor to win a Medal of Honor on U.S. soil. He was the first beyond Pearl Harbor to win a Medal of Honor post the Indian Wars of the 1890s. That's how long it was. Now, Martinez did not survive his actions, so his award was given posthumously. But what happened was Martinez's regiment had been pinned down near a place called Fishhook Ridge. So here you have Martinez and his comrades. They're pinned down as they advance on the Japanese. Well, Martinez, realizing the situation, led 2 separate assaults on the entrenched Japanese. And this guy operated a bar rifle, which was like the M60 precursor. So this guy's like a light machine gunner. So he ended up charging the Japanese foxholes with his bar rifle. He leads one assault. He kills 5 Japanese in their foxhole. Well, after he captures the first foxhole, his men followed him. Well, then what he did, he wasn't done. He decided to attack the next foxhole. So he attacks the next foxhole and captures it with his men following. So 1 foxhole, 2 foxholes. So he attacked a third. He attacks a third, leading the charge. He attacks the third and final foxhole, and he was shot in the head. That hero has 3 statues in his honor in Colorado. He actually had a troop transport in Korea named after him. But here you have this Martinez, a forgotten hero that won a Medal of Honor in a forgotten conflict. But that is the Aleutian Islands campaign of World War II. The Japanese and the Americans fought in the snow in the Pacific theater of World War II. Just an interesting historical footnote. I think it's so interesting. So one last quick hit. There was a lot of big Monday news coming out of the Supreme Court. I think we're still waiting on the birthright citizenship ruling. That should be coming this week. We're going to lose that one. But I got this information right before I started recording the show, and it's not great news. So the case that I thought was going to be a big win for the administration was this Election Day case. And what it was, the case revolved around a Mississippi law that was allowing mail-in ballots to be counted for days after election day. It's election day. That's what drives me mental with this. It's election day. It's not election week. It's not election month. Having this country run on counting mail-in ballots for weeks after the fact is a fraud center. But this case in the Supreme Court went 5-4 against the administration. So we now have a Supreme Court ruling 5-4 that ballots now may be counted after Election Day. So ballots now legally can be counted for weeks after Election Day. It's a total fraud center having in our voting the fact that you can count this after the fact. This is upheld as legal that you can now have an election week, election month. 5-4. I thought it would go 5-4 against this, that we would have an election day and voting would be secured. That's not what happened. You have Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts joining the liberal wing of the Supreme Court in the majority opinion. So to be completely clear with this ruling, it is now legal in the United States of America based on what the Supreme Court just decided that ballots can be counted forever after Election Day. The only wrinkle that you can look at it as positive, the ruling states that these ballots must be postmarked in time, which is a total joke. Because does anybody in Illinois, New York, California, do we really think that these states are going to be honest? Do you really mean to tell me that Illinois, New York, and California are going to be serious checking postmarks? What this really means is that elections legally have no finish line in the United States. And I guess that's great news if you want to cheat in elections. And the problem that I have with this particular ruling is that people really don't believe in election results right now. Look at what just happened a couple of weeks ago in LA. You had Spencer Pratt, half of Spidey, that was at 30% on election day. So physical voting on election day, Spencer Pratt was at 30% of the vote. 30%. Well, you had a mail-in drop of 24,000 votes. A mail-in drop of 24,000 votes, and he got 0 of the 24,000. The communist that was in third place got the bulk of them. The statistical probability of mail-in balloting coming in at 24,000 on a candidate at 30%, the statistical probability that is in the trillions. It cannot happen. So just a massive mistake, in my opinion, by the Supreme Court. This one kind of blew my mind. The problem with it is now, if you're not going to have an election day, if you're going to have an election week, election month, the only way you're going to fix this now is by getting the SAVE Act passed. Or what you would have to do is you would have to codify Trump's executive order on mail-in balloting. And that's really the problem, isn't it? Because Congress isn't going to change this. There's no way you're going to have an amendment to the Constitution. It's the same as birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship, if a Guatemalan migrant pops a baby out 5 minutes after walking on U.S. soil, that baby is now an American citizen. The only way you're going to change any of these things is with a constitutional amendment or some type of law coming out of Congress. And I think we all understand that's never going to happen. Even if Trump's executive order is upheld, you could get a Democrat president that overrides it. It's an executive order. It has the force of law only in that administration or until it's returned. So I guess the problem with this is more broadly, when you look at our elections, that extended voting now is basically here to stay. And if extended voting is here to stay, what that means is that it just deepens the fraud in blue states. That is a really problematic decision, and we're all going to deal with that for years. And I guess secondarily, there was also a Supreme Court decision that came out on Monday that looked at the executive's authority to fire federal bureaucrats. And that case was Trump versus Slaughter, and they got that one right. Because of course an executive has to be able to get rid of bureaucrats. And good. Why would the that would be like saying a CEO of a company can't get rid of people in the company. Like, why? If the CEO decides that they want to get rid of an entire branch of the company, they can do it. And I guess, again, good. Now Trump can go ahead and fire all these leftover snakes. I mean, you've got Obama, Biden people like embedded in the federal government. There's communists. Get these people out, man. They're like termites in wood. These people crawl into the wood and they embed themselves, and that's permanent Washington. That's the deep state. Because if a Republican president cannot fire bureaucrats, they're never going to leave. So what that means is even when the American people elect a new candidate, they're stuck with the same people in government. It's like Anthony Fauci. He never leaves. He's just a parasite that sits there and collects a paycheck. It's just unbelievable. There's going to be a lot coming out on the Supreme Court this week. Don't despair on it. We will get through all this stuff, but it's just really disappointing to watch Coney Barrett, John Roberts, who's just a complete failure. It's just a shame ideologically watching these people, but just keep watching the Supreme Court and keep praying. So finally, I'll go ahead and wrap the show up. I wanted to make a quick show note. So my wife made the executive decision. We are actually going to head out of town early Friday for the 4th of July. And to be fair, I'm totally pumped about it. We're going to be going to the Lake of the Ozarks, and it's going to be just absolutely wild. We have friends of ours that have a couple boats, and it's going to be amazing down at the lake. I can't wait for it. But I keep thinking about the 4th of July and the 250th anniversary. I wanted to share a quick story. When I was a kid, I had this huge American flag in my bedroom, and that flag was actually a bicentennial flag. So what it was this huge American flag with a bicentennial logo with the dates on it. It was July 4th, 1776, and then you had July 4th, 1976. Now, the funny thing about that flag, I was actually born in 1977, so I was not alive during the bicentennial. But my dad had served 6 years in the military, and he had that flag from this parade that he attended. And as a kid, it was totally I drank in George Washington. I drank in the founding. I thought it was so interesting that these guys fought the English. I thought it was great. But I was fascinated by that flag, and I was fascinated by 200 years. It's the greatest political experiment of all time. So I had this flag as a kid, and I kept thinking man, it's going to be crazy when the 250th rolled around. Well, here we are. We're hitting 250. And I've been thinking a lot about this over the last few weeks, and I was actually driving my daughter around. My daughter's 15, and we were talking about the 250th. And I told her, because she's asking me questions, and I was telling her about this flag, but I told her that she's going to live to see 250, and then she's going to see 300 too. And just even thinking about the 300th anniversary, that just kind of blows my mind. These kids, a 15-year-old kid is going to see so much in the next 50 years. And you're seeing this just complete overhaul in the US right now. And an overhaul is nothing new in the Republic, right? America has been born again and again and again. But the thread there, that spirit of 1776 still runs in our blood. It's like electing Trump. It was defying the establishment. It's always something where you're grasping onto the spirit of revolution. But it's funny because I think it takes a lot to wake America up, but I think it's awake now. The hour is late, and we were really close to the edge, but there's still patriots left here in the States, man. And I can tell you from my personal experience, I look at everything through the lens of COVID. There was a small percentage of people that stood up and fought back in COVID, people who spoke out, people who argued against the establishment, local government, schools. Just normal moms and dads in both parties that saw what was happening and decided to make a stand. That was 5 years ago. It was a small sliver of people. And the thing that I would tell you is that there are so many more people awake now. There have been so many red pills that have occurred over the last 5 years. I talked about Biden in the debate stage, where he just malfunctioned on live TV. That was probably the biggest red pill of them all. So when I look at today versus 5 years ago, I don't think a COVID could happen again now. There's just been too many patriots activated. And again, both sides of the aisle. Too many people awake, too many patriots awake. But I guess that's really no different than 1776, isn't it? People were awake back in 1776 to what the British were doing. People saw what the British were doing and they fought back. But if you look at it, it was only 2% of colonists that fought back. And what happens is it's always a small percentage of patriots that start the fight. And when they start that fight, it draws people to the cause. And I keep thinking about that it's the same thing over and it's echoes, right? But I'm telling you right now, in 50 years, that the patriots, the awake patriots, they're going to be needed again. And the thing that makes me feel good about America headed to 300 now, I see a lot of strength in younger people. They're a lot more aware. They're a lot more awake than I ever was. And like, look at a person like my daughter. She's 15 years old. These younger people are going to see some crazy stuff in their lives on the march to 300. And they don't know it yet, but these younger people are going to be tasked with keeping America alive and the world spinning. They're going to have a massive burden put on them, and I feel bad about it. I have a 17-year-old son. I have a 15-year-old daughter. There's a massive burden that's going to be put on these kids' head, and the reason why is the facts is that Western civilization is going to make its last stand in America. It has to. If you look at everything that I talk about or what you observe with your own two eyes, Western civilization largely is floundering in places like Europe and elsewhere. And man, it was teetering here. You almost had Kamala Harris elected. But if you look at freedom, if you look at the light of liberty, if you look at Western civilization, America is going to be the last stand. And I think that's so amazing for our children. Like, these kids are going to lead that forward. They're going to lead an America that's going to have to be a leader of free peoples across the globe. America has to be the thing that people look towards. And these kids are going to grow up to be the leaders here. And I guess if you look at it, like right now, that war, that conflict, that assault on Western society, right now that assault is ideological, but that situation is going to accelerate in the next 5 to 15 years. But you look at 15-year-olds now, those are going to be the leaders of the republic that are going to get us to 300. And I guess the thing that you would hope about, like I'm looking at my daughter and her friends, my son and his friends, like, is there a George Washington in that mix of people? A Joseph Warren, a Patrick Henry? We made it to 250, man, but those kids are going to have to get it to 300. And you really hope there's somebody like that in that mix. And it's not just getting to 300. It's amazing to think about. My kids' kids are going to get us to 350. And that's the point, isn't it? It's how do we make it better for the people behind us? How do we get it to 250, to 300, to 350, to 400? That's the responsibility that we're given to keep the flame lit. So anyway, I just wanted to make a note about July 4th. I'm so excited for it. This is more than likely going to be the only show this week. I just really want everybody to have a wonderful July 4th. I want you to be around the people that you love. And I guess God bless America. So I'll go ahead and wrap the show up. If you like the show, please go ahead and tell a friend about it. If you would, please also follow us on Spotify. You can also follow us on Instagram at Foggy Dew Daily. If you have questions for the show, please go ahead and email us at foggydew95@gmail.com. But as we hit July 4th, man, I urge you to say a prayer, ask questions, and stay vigilant. This is the Foggy Dew signing off.